According to the report of Bank of Uganda, Uganda's public debt stands at over 78 trillion Uganda shillings. Previously, we had the budget where Uganda's public debt was standing at 73 trillion. Now, this shows an increment in the past years. Now, we are going to discuss the status of Uganda's public debt and whether it is sustainable. Let me introduce the panelists to the talk show. I'll start with the first panelist that is seated next to me. Most of the faces are familiar to the inter-university debate. I'll start with Mr. Ssemuyaba Arthur. Arthur is pursuing a Bachelor of Laws from Uganda Matyrs University in Nkozi, and he is the Chief Justice of the university. So we have Honorable Owindolo here. So welcome to the inter-university debate.
Thank you.
Okay, our second panelist is Ms. Namuddu Sylvia Kisakye. She's also pursuing Bachelor of Laws, and she's the Secretary in Vice President's Office at the university. You're welcome to the debate.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so our third panelist, he normally gives me hardships in pronouncing his name. That is Mr. Natuhwera Ronald. He is the Deputy Chief Justice at Uganda Matyrs University in Nkozi and also pursuing Bachelor of Laws. You're welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Our fourth panelist is Ms. Nalukaake Racheal Ruth. She is pursuing Bachelor of Journalism and Mass Communication and Secretary General at the university. So we have a panel of leaders. You're welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So these are our panelists for today. I'm your host. My name is Racheal Gender Fancy. Inter-University Debate is brought to you by Center for Constitutional Governance and Civic Space TV. So let us kickstart the discussion on the status of Uganda's public debt. Over the years, it has been increasing, and now BOU says it stands at over 78 trillion. Way more than it. Something I've said before on the talk show, way more than the budget that we are running. Now, when we had the budget speech last year in June on 14th, if I still remember well, they mentioned clearly, the Minister of Finance, that even the current budget we are planning to borrow money to fund it, it will be funded by both tax collection and as well as by debt. Now, that means the public debt will continue to increase. In his speech, he attributed it to several things that led to the increment, and I hope we will unpack that today in the discussion. But let's start with Arthur. Arthur, if you can kickstart this discussion. Today we are sitting 2023. What is the current status of Uganda's public debt?
Well, the current status of Uganda's public debt, per now as the Bank of Uganda reports, is over 78 trillion. This constitutes about 53% of our GDP. And we see that there are various factors that have inspired the growth of our public debt. And to check whether this debt is sustainable is really a question of critical analysis. But then looking at that background, we see that COVID-19 has also played a major role in improving on our public debt, which is quite worrisome. So I think with the background of our public debt, we have to think of various ways on how we can mitigate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Arthur. Let me move to Sylvia. So Sylvia, Arthur mentioned one reason being COVID-19. And my question is, to what extent did COVID-19 lead to the increment in public debt? Or this is something that we are trying to rely on, but there is a very small edge to that?
COVID-19 led to an increase in the public debt, but we shouldn't over-rely on COVID-19. We have a lot of factors other than COVID-19 that led to the rise of the public debt. Because when we saw COVID-19, To some extent, yes, but to a smaller extent, because COVID-19 led to low manufacturing of goods, low exportation of goods, so we couldn't get the annual revenue as we used to get it. So, and people had to get their salaries, so the government had to borrow money to finance what was supposed to be done in the country, to finance the different research about COVID, to finance salaries, to finance a lot of projects. But again, apart from COVID, COVID is to a very small extent. Apart from COVID, we have other things. During that COVID time, there was a lot of corruption. So we are trying so much to hinge on COVID, yet we as Ugandans, apart from COVID, during the COVID period, or I can say the leaders, we did a lot of corruption. We had a lot of sagas about lost money. Now, if we hadn't borrowed that money, maybe we wouldn't have a rise in the debt. And also, if we had a way of combating, fighting our risks, instead of borrowing money, we would borrow equipment for the doctors or the nurses instead of money that was embezzled. We all had a lot of saga about COVID money. So we are trying so much to clinch on a virus, yet we as Ugandans, the leaders, were corrupt and took the money. So I wouldn't say much that COVID did a lot of, brought a lot of issues in the rise of the public debt. It comes back to the planning of the country, the physical planning, and the people that lead us, that handle our money.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sylvia. Before I move to the next person, we have listened to several people say COVID exposed a lot of challenges that were already existing within the system. What is your perspective on that?
It is true, because we didn't know that we didn't have a national treasury for disaster. We are not prepared for disaster. So disaster came and we had to borrow money. We Ugandans didn't know that actually the government does not have money in the treasury for disaster preparedness. It exposed a lot of corruption of different researchers. Some came out and they were making researches for vaccines, but till now, we've not yet seen the vaccines for COVID. Others, we lost a lot of equipment for hospitals. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yes, I see you have something.
I want to add on a little
Yes,
about
please do.
the COVID issue. So, yes, COVID came in, but even before it came in, the rate at which our percentage of earning, like the economic growth, was still very low. The economic growth was just at 3%, yet the debit then, before COVID, was at 22%. So still that shows us that, yes, COVID did contribute, but it's not like COVID alone that we shouldn't like really rely on COVID as a big thing, though it also did contribute.
Okay. Thank you so much, Racheal, for that addition. Let me move to Ronald. So, Ronald, what are some of the reasons why we, as a country, we have had skyrocketing increment in public debt?
Yeah, thank you. I think the reasons why we are having skyrocketing debt is, first of all, when our budget is read, of course, we don't anticipate the supplementary budgets that come in. But then as the year moves on, we get the supplementary budgets from the State House, from the Army, and some of these budgets are they are confidential. They are referred to as, there's a term they normally use, that they are what? There's a term they normally use to that they are confidential, they are not open to the public. So we appropriate money to that, and in the event we need to, so we finance or get loans. And of course, that is that we venture into domestic borrowing, international borrowing, to finance those loans. And in the event, our debt grows. So that could be one of the major reasons as to why our debt is skyrocketing at the moment. And then the other thing is, when we venture into our sectors, the different sectors, could be agriculture, how are we investing in those sectors? Those sectors, yes, we are investing money. And then the money that we are investing, of course, we are trying to get it from, sourcing it from, of course, borrowing. So that money, when we borrow it, put it in that sector, sometimes it is embezzled by the different leaders at the different levels. Of course, the leaders, that has been the reason as to why our debt has been skyrocketing, in that money does not get to the final destination of the intended purpose. If we borrow, let's take for instance $80 million at the moment, we want to invest that money to the agriculture sector. And of course, the different levels, this money will move from, of course, the national treasury, then move on to the leaders, then the leaders to the final person, the farmer that gets this money. Then this farmer, of course, will buy the agriculture, of course, the seeds, plant those seeds. He has not added the value in what he has planted. So when you don't do that, then he will not pay back the loan. Of course, normally that money is given as a soft loan to these farmers. So he will not get that money because he has not added value to anything. He has just planted, he will harvest, then take the produce, sell the produce relatively at a cheap price. So in the event, the government will also find it difficult in trying to recoup that money that was given to that farmer. So they will fail, and of course, at the end, the government now gets a skyrocketing debt. And then, of course, their reason could be the revenue collection also. How best do we collect our revenue? Recently, normally these companies that come in, of course, the Chinese companies, now take, for instance, these companies that come in, the president normally says that these companies are, of course, investors. He refers to them as investors. Investors come to our country, we give them a tax holiday of 10 years. And then this tax holiday of 10 years, of course, this investor is getting money. And the profits he's getting is plowing them back to his homeland. That could be China or wherever. And now this tax holiday, we should be using that as an avenue of getting revenue from them, because these people are conducting business in our state. But then at the end of the day, we are giving them a tax holiday. This tax holiday, they are utilizing that tax holiday to get profits, plow them back, and then after the period of 10 years, this person would declare the company insolvent. And once he has declared the company insolvent, he goes back. So we've not got anything from that investor. Ideally, at the end of the day, our debts will skyrocket. The revenue collection, we are not servicing the loans, and our debt will obviously skyrocket.
Okay, thank you so much.
I would love to add a
Yeah,
little
please.
thing.
Yeah.
Another reason is also we borrow for consumption instead of production. When you see countries, the already developed countries, they borrow to produce something so that they get a profit out of something. But we borrow to consume. We borrow to pay salaries, which does not bring profit to us. We borrow to fight something, to fight disasters, which disasters do not bring back profit. So we should learn to borrow to produce, which produce will bring profit to us so that we pay that debt instead of borrowing just for consumption and embezzlement.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Racheal, what is your perspective on the different reasons, especially the ones advanced by government for the increment in the level of debt?
What's my
Perspective.
okay? So I don't think I've got the question well.
Okay,
really.
why do you think there has been an increment?
Oh, okay. Why I think there has been an increment? I'm not really going to differ from my colleague. There has been an increment because of the way we do our revenue mobilization. Yeah, in a policy paper of the Southern and East African Trade Information, they were showing how most of the low-developed countries, including Uganda, collect their revenue. And that includes what my colleague said, where they give foreigners tax holidays and all that, which is putting the country down. Also, the upward moving, the upward projects that are like moving on. So we have different projects that the country is like holding on, things like the Emyoga, where they give money and they expect the different people to work and bring back. But those ones are actually, people are just embezzling funds and they're actually not bringing back to the government. Like I said earlier, statistics has shown us that only it has just increased by, then before COVID it was by just 3%. Then it has just increased by 5%, which is 5 is not okay for a country to grow. That's why there are those increments in the country. Yeah.
Okay. Before I come back this side, let me just ask you something on that, Racheal. So the government has tried to come up with several projects, especially for the youth in that area. And there are other projects for the whole country. We have had Youth Livelihood Fund, Operation Wealth Creation, Emyoga. There is just several. In the north, there's NUSAF. I think they are now in NUSAF 3, 1, 2, 3. They're now in 3. Now, those projects that the government has come up with, now we have parish development model.
Yes.
So why hasn't such projects tremendously reduced our debt?
Well, I think because of often, like, I think why they haven't is the opportunity is not limited to a few. It's limited to the youth. Okay, I believe they should limit it to, they should put, they should limit it in a way that it's put to probably the youth who do not have something of the sort. Or I believe it has not worked because they are giving to anyone as long as you sign up for it. As long as you sign up for it, like the Emyoga, where they were giving the saloon people, even if someone is already financially stable, or like they already have their money, people are just taking in money and not giving back to the government. I think that is why the thing is not coming out well. I don't know really.
Yes, Ronald. You know, there was a time I was watching news some time back, and it was very dramatic when I think that was in Ginger, when some cattle was distributed, and then I think Opondo also received, and during the discussion, during news, they showed how he received it. Then later he was interviewed. He said it was his wife. Then later, NTV was able to produce the list of people who received cattle. And his actual name was on the list. Then the discussion got very dramatic during Frontline between him and Maria Matembe. Then I was like, what's up with this project that the government keep bringing? Could this be some of the reasons why the projects keep on failing? You know, they are meant for the poor people, and then it's being received by other people.
Yeah, basically maybe to supplement that, the reason is that now these programs are just a rebrand. See, the Emyoga, you have the Emyoga, then later you have the operation. We started with Operation Wealth Creation, I think. then we went on to the Myoga, then the youth livelihood programs. So they are just a rebrand. So we need to go back and see, why are these programs, why have they not been successful? Reason is that you've given is that the money that is being given, that is being injected in those programs, goes to the people that already have. And sometimes the other reason could be that sometimes the money that is being injected, the youth do not know how to use. Sometimes now you can imagine someone, a youth like me, I don't own a piece of land, but you're giving me maybe 5 goats, that I should start with those. So ideally, I don't have a place or a piece of land where I'm going to take care of those goats. So sometimes those projects are misdirected, and we can take a leaf from these developing countries. These developing countries, what they do is that they equip people with skills. It could be in education. Educate these youth. Yes, we have programs there. You can argue that we have USE, we have UPE, but those are not enough. Let's get to the university level. The university level, the government sponsorship programs is only limited to those people that have passed highly. But then we have the other bracket, the people that have not passed well. So why don't we inject that money to the education sector, more especially at the university level, where these people can get the necessary skills?
But okay, yes, but Ronald, government even started the loan scheme program, where people were supposed to pay back the money, and we have seen the recent reports, people are not paying back that money, you know, forcing government to have to waive some of those, you know, expenses. So how much more should the government inject into the education sector in educating the youth?
Yeah, thank you. I was getting to that actually. The loan scheme, it's a loan scheme. At the end of your studies, you're obliged to pay back that money. But yet, on the other side, government is giving this money for free, the Myoga money. They are handouts. And sometimes these handouts, people are not expected to pay them back. They don't pay back under the different youth livelihood programs. Why doesn't the state give that free education at the university level, not necessarily based on the loan scheme? Then these people, once they have obtained the different skills, then they get to exercise those skills. Now, of course, the job market, given the job market here in Uganda, has not been good, and it will never be good. It's a competitive one. But now, given that it is competitive one gets that money, gets a job, and you have to now, of course, service the loan that you obtain while you're studying. That, in a way, does not motivate one to work actually, because you can imagine your loan is something like, let's take for instance 8 million, and the job that you, of course, gives you something like 200,000. So it becomes a problem, and this does not motivate you actually. Some people even end up resigning. At the end of the day, person will say, why am I working? I'm working to service a loan. So I think the government should shift from just giving a loan scheme and they should just give free education to the people.
And also to add something, I've never in my life seen a developed country that is giving its citizens money to develop. It is not there. It just brings incentives, things that will develop, like putting industries, teaching youth different skills, but no government really gets money, gives to youth, and you think it's going to develop. I've never seen it anywhere.
Okay, thank you. Let me get back to Arthur. So Arthur, internationally, when you put Uganda out there, how are we doing in terms of our level of debt?
How are we doing? Well, the question as to how we are performing regarding our public debts and in regards to other countries, we need to try to look at what motivates the debt growth and what motivates the debt growth elsewhere. So I would first refer you to the documentary that was projected by Jack Tran, And in his documentary, it is entitled China's Business in Africa, where he gave examples of different countries like Sri Lanka, whereby in 2009, Sri Lanka was indebted, whereby it got debts from China, and it got about 307 million to finance a project of a port in its southern part. And this port was to see that they were to improve on their economy. But we said that when this port started in 2012, this port did not yield the profits they had anticipated before. So having failed to get the projects that they had anticipated, they failed to pay back this debt. So what China did, they had to renegotiate with Sri Lanka, and China compelled Sri Lanka to give away 85% of the port. And this port, whatever came out of the port, the money, 85% of it had to be given to Sri Lanka. Now, but this debt trap has not been new. It has been used by different countries like United States of America, and according to various scholars, for example, John Perkins, in his infamous book, The Confessions of the Economic Hitman, he espoused the various ways how these superpowers have been dropping different low-developing countries into the public debt trap. And when we look at different countries like Ecuador, Panama, all these countries have been indebted in a way that United States of America would give loans to these countries and to make sure that they do not be able to pay back. And he fronts an argument that United States of America would give loans to countries that had different resources like oil, gas, oil, uranium and others, and copper. And when they realized that these countries have these resources, they would organize a huge debt, a huge loan to borrow to these countries. And these loans, they would know that in the long run, they would be unable to pay them. So through different organizations like the World Bank and its sister organizations, they would give debts to, they would give loans to these low-developing countries. And we see that when they gave these loans to these countries would then see on the face value of it, it is really a good idea that they are giving you money to build roads, to build refineries and different mines. But in the long run, they know that when they give you this money, you are going, okay, they put up various conditions whereby you are going to use their corporations to see that you construct these projects. And these corporations would then expatriate this money back to their home countries. So this money would be in a continuous loop that it comes from United States of America to the low developing country, used by its corporations, then it goes back to the US. So this money then would be in a continuous rotation. So you see that with that, in the long run, these countries could not maintain these projects, whereby if they've heavily funded these projects, it means they would use heavy machinery, which are quite expensive, and they need to be sustained. So money would kept on to be injected in these projects to maintain to keep them running. So in the long run, these countries would fail to pay back, and USA would then now force these countries to now sign different agreements. And through the World Bank, they would sign the structural adjustment, plan, whereby they would force these low developing countries to sell off their resources at cheaper prices, like gold at cheaper prices. Then they would force them to privatize their public sector. And after privatizing it, then investors from United States would come in and buy these sectors like the health sector, education, and others. So after privatizing, then it was then now the citizens that would suffer to pay back in terms of paying for these services. So now this money would then be expatriated back to United States. So you see that now, this time around, they are benefiting from the loans they gave to these low developing countries. Now, looking at, back to your question as Uganda's performance internationally, we are going to first start with East Africa. And we see that Kenya of recent is the one that has been advancing more loans, more than any other East African country. And of recent, it borrowed around more than 53 billion. And then it was followed by Uganda.
Kenya shillings.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Then followed by Rwanda and South Sudan of recent. And then when you compare with other countries like United States, yes, they also have a very huge public debt. However, the way how they use their public debts, you realize that when they borrow this money, they inject it into businesses that yield money. Unlike for Uganda, that for us, when we get money, we aim at building various infrastructures, and of which they rarely yield much profit. Of recent, we had to borrow money from the Exim Bank to build the Entebbe Express highway. So you realize that the projects that have been put up by governments usually do not yield as much money as they anticipate. But United States of America, they borrow money to inject in different businesses, and also to uplift their investors and the farmers. Of recent, in COVID-19,
as you wind up.
yes, in COVID-19, I was watching a particular documentary, and they say that United States, under the leadership of Donald Trump, they borrowed money and then they gave money to different farmers to try to to maintain their factories and their farms working. So this money was used to earn a profit rather than just putting it into projects that were not going to yield money.
Okay. Thank you so much. I thought that was an in-depth comparison and looking at the different aspects. So when Arthur was speaking, I was trying to relate to Uganda's situation, where we used to borrow from World Bank, and then there were those conditions of privatize, make sure you privatize, most of your sectors. Now, let me bring in Sylvia. So, Sylvia, what is your perspective on Uganda now borrowing from countries like China? We used to borrow heavily from, we still externally borrow heavily, but it used to be heavily from IMF, World Bank, those multinational international organizations. So now that we have shifted to borrow from China, like Exim Bank of China, what is your perspective on that?
I think borrowing from a particular country to some extent would bring in some levels. I don't want to call it colonialism, but yes, that is the word I have in my head. Because when you borrow from a country like China, it is going to bring its own people. Like for Exim, we borrowed from Exim Bank, which is in China, and still it is the Chinese that came to construct our road. And borrowing from a country like Exim Bank, like from a bank in China, like Exim Bank, brings in high level of interest. In most cases, they are usually like 2-digit interest rates. Yet when you're borrowing from IMF or World Bank, those organizations, it is a 1-digit interest rate. So it is burdensome to a country like Uganda, which is poor per se, to borrow from countries like China, which will come and force a lot of their stuff on us. Like we've had the sag of the airport. I don't know if it was authentic.
Yeah. Actually, when Uganda borrowed, they waived certain rights, meaning if they fail to pay, China could take a state-owned property or something.
Now that is the problem. As he said, we would learn from countries like Sri Lanka. We don't want China to come here when we fail to pay the debt for the express and take part of the express to get money out of it. It wouldn't look good. So it is so bad to be borrowing from a country particularly. We would stay on borrowing from organizations because organizations were mainly put for that purpose, not banks, and moreover foreign banks in some countries that are imposing a lot of things on us.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me bring Ronald into that discussion. So Ronald, on one hand, we have IMF, World Bank, countries that we are a member of. I mean, organizations that we are a member of. But we have seen those conditions come in. Privatize. We want democracy in your country. We want to say rule of law, human rights on one hand. And then on the other hand, we have like Exim Bank of China that will not say, as we don't want to hear those things of democracy, rule of law, human rights. But if you fail to pay, we are going to take a state-owned parastat or a state-owned something, you know. And in this case, we were scared for the Entebbe airport. Which way do you think Uganda should choose?
Yeah, thank you very much. And this question is quite interesting. Reason is that, you see, when we divert now from borrowing from IMF and so on, the established organizations, to borrowing from countries like China under the Exim Bank. Now, these loans come with hefty conditions. Conditions that, one, when a state fails to when its state fails to service the loan, the conditions will take precedence. So now these conditions, like the Entebbe saga, I was also debating its authenticity, but you've clarified that. Now these conditions, such conditions now, yes, the loans, they may give us the loans, but you realize that even when we get the loans, the contractors are from China. The bidding, the given contracts, and I believe those clauses are in those contracts that, when we give you this loan, the contractor has to be in China, because we have contractors around. But then you realize that the money that we inject in those contracts now, the contractors, is diverted. Is diverted now. These people will plow back the profits, like I said earlier. But now the way to go is that we shouldn't get loans from those states, because those conditions? Those conditions are motivated by, now, states like China. Those states are, I may refer to them as ambitious states. Now, a state that will want to take your international airport is ambitious to me. And once it takes your international airport, what are you left with? Meaning that with time, if we keep on getting debts and so on from those states, our country will end up divided. We'll end up with no state. You will be here, and then they will tell you that, no, this airport belongs to this state. This airport, and when you consider borrowing from organizations like IMF, those organizations actually tend to go and even see your debt. They give you recommendations. They will even guide you. They guide you on how you utilize the debt, on how you can mitigate the debt. But states like China, they don't mind. As long as you sign, it's a win-win. We give you the money and you pay us back. If you fail to pay, we bring in those conditions. We enforce those conditions that you signed. So it's better to borrow from organizations like IMF, because at the end, you realize that these organizations publish reports on the status of our indebtedness to them. And these reports sometimes are like eye-openers to our state and our parliamentarians on how best to advise the state. But if we keep in the dark on getting a loan from China that will not follow up the loan, that will even never publish a report. I've not seen a report.
Actually, even the agreement has been there are a lot of secrets around I've not seen the agreement come out in the public.
Yeah, you will never see that agreement, I believe. And keeping in the dark is very dangerous, because we don't know the status of that debt. How far have we serviced that debt? But if it was for IMF, every year they publish a report on the status, on how they can mitigate. And sometimes these organizations, sometimes they waive these debts. They waive a debt for certain state. They can waive a debt, given debt. But now a state like China will never waive off a debt. You have to pay. The end date is you have to pay. And that is why I think the express highway, we are still paying that toll told you have to pay when you're using that road. So I think as a state, we shouldn't get loans from these states because they come with conditions sometimes. Now, for instance, like USA will give a condition, will say, yes, we'll give you this money you want, but then you'll have to enforce certain laws. We've seen the gay bill that was shelved. It was never assented to by the president. So now you see there's a level of dependency that is created. See, a state that will give you a loan will bring in those conditions, and those conditions create a wave of dependency that you will have to depend. Even your legislation or legal frameworks will tend to work the other way around, not on what you expect as a state.
Okay.
Well, I would wish to interject a little bit on why African countries like Uganda are preferring China over IMF and different European countries. One, we need to appreciate the history on how these countries have been relating. If we see that, if we look at the history, we see that China and African countries were both colonized. And when China is forwarding these loans, they are trying to put up the agenda that we are fighting colonialism. And in the new era, it's neo-colonialism. And we see the terms and conditions which China imposes on these loans and those that imposed by IMF and other European countries are a little bit quite different. And if we are to look at these conditions, we see that African countries will always go back to appreciating China more than these European countries. If we look at the nature of these agreements or these contracts, we see that when China is forwarding a loan to this low developing country, it will put up conditions that they will not interfere with the country's internal affairs, meaning for them theirs is purely economic. And then secondly, they choose not to interfere on how this money is being spent. So dictatorial governments in Africa will feel like, yes, there's a little bit of secrecy within how we conduct our affairs. So no country is going to interfere with how we are going to use this money.
So Arthur, is it okay for the government to sign loan agreements with countries where, in case we fail to pay, we lose a state-owned property? Imagine one day we have to lose parliament. So is it okay? You see, how do we strike a balance there? Is it okay to enter into such loan agreements?
Well, if you look at both sides, China, IMF, and other European countries, it is the same. That if you fail to pay, we take your resources. And as I had mentioned before, if you look at the book by John Perkins, The Confessions of the Economic Hitman, we see that USA, which is one of the funders of IMF and all those organizations, we see that he says that through the World Bank and the IMF, they would advance loans to low developing countries. And these low developing countries, when they fail to pay, they force them through a different mode of payment. They would advance the structure adjustment program, whereby you now have to adjust on how you're going to pay the loan. How? By surrendering your resources. So now either way, either IMF or China, it is the same thing. Because we have already seen in countries like Sri Lanka losing their ports. We see in countries like Ecuador, Panama, all the same thing has been happening with USA. And they have been getting these loans from World Bank. Now, the same thing with China. But then what makes the difference and why African countries keep on running back to China rather than IMF and World Bank is that African countries are tired of being interfered with on how they handle different issues. For example, human rights. We see that Western countries are tending to front the idea of LGBT, of which African countries are really not willing to appreciate, to adopt. So you see that China, when China is giving you the loan, they are not putting up these conditions. They are saying, for us, we are giving you the money as long as you pay.
Okay.
At some point, can I?
Yes.
At some
Sylvia.
point, I don't agree with Arthur, because now when you see China is taking back profit to their countries, yet we already have their loan which are paying an interest for. So we are paying an interest for them. We have to pay back the loan. Then again, they are bringing their own engineers on the roads. Ugandans are only left with jobs like masons and porters.
Well, it's the same with IMF and World Bank. They still do the same.
No, it doesn't do the same.
Okay, let me bring Ronald into the discussion, then we move on.
Yeah, I would actually like to depart from my colleague. Then this thing is that when this debt is given, China and Uganda, such a debt, they give conditions. Those conditions are very hefty, leave alone the things of human rights and stuff. But given that, why we try to shift to that end is that sometimes the IMF will publish a report and say, no, look, you're hitting the debt ceiling. Why don't you resort to other means? Why do you keep on borrowing money and stuff? And then the country like China will be ready to give the loan. We'll have the money, we'll say, no, come, and we are giving you the loan of how many trillions. And we go there and get the loan, we sign and get the loan. Now, because if we are told we'll go in the nitty-gritties of the IMF saying, no, you're hitting the debt ceiling, we cannot give you this amount of money because you've hit the debt ceiling. And China is saying, yeah, you've hit the debt ceiling, but we are giving you the money. That is why we easily go to countries like China to get that amount of money because they can readily give it. We don't need to go in the paperwork and the nitty-gritties. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ronald. We'll get back into that discussion and move on. Let's take a short break and we'll still be coming back with the students of Uganda Matyrs University in Kozi.
Digital rights are those human rights and legal rights that allow individuals to access, use, create and publish digital media or to access and use computers, other electronic devices and telecommunication networks. Digital rights include a right to freedom of expression, information and communication through technology, a right to privacy and data protection, a right to credit for personal works, a right to universal and equal digital access, a right to identity, a right to anonymity, a right to be forgotten, and a right for protection of minors, among others. The state's digital rights are frequently violated through various unfair actions, for example, blockage of websites and social networks, theft of credentials, unauthorized use of people's data for personal gain, privacy intrusion, online censorship, arrests and intimidation of online users, internet blockages, and the proliferation of laws and regulations that undermine the potential of technology to drive social, economic, and political development worldwide. It is hence every citizen's responsibility to respect rights of other digital users and to speak out or report to the responsible parties when one's rights are violated.
Welcome back from that short break. We are still with students of Uganda Matyrs University in Kozi, and we are discussing the state of Uganda's public debt and whether it is sustainable. So before that break, we had a heated discussion on IMF and World Bank versus borrowing from other countries like China. So Racheal, since you were not part of that discussion, we are going to bring you into it, but from a different angle. Now, when we look at the World Bank report that was published, it shows Uganda borrows heavily from external sources. 68% of Uganda's public debt is from external sources. That includes both World Bank, China, IMF, all those compared to internally. What is your perspective on that?
Well, my perspective on that is that as Uganda, we are just, I should say, inflicting wounds on ourselves. I don't know how to say it best. Because like my colleague said, Sylvia, we do not borrow for profit. We borrow for just things like infrastructures, just like the Exim, when we borrowed from the Exim Bank. So like we are actually just we are not adding on as a country to ourselves. Instead, we are straining, and our debit is really, like, it's really pushed to the wall, because before it was 15, it was around 15 point something. Now it has really increased to 18. And like as a country, it's not well, because even we saw the minister, Mr. Henry Musasizi, standing in front of the parliament and like real confessing that as a country we are not okay, like we lack a lot of credit, and like just my colleague said, Arthur, he confessed, paraphrasing because I can't say exactly what he said, but in his speech he was talking about how the oil is how they had a little bit stopped on the oil because they had to pay in some envelope money. And the envelope money, as citizens of Uganda, we actually don't know about it. So that's the money. Those are the different things, like the Exim loan we took that they do not show us. So I don't think I do not think it's really okay, because first of all, we are not gaining from it, and we are actually just losing as a country.
Okay, thank you. Let me also push that question to Arthur. Arthur, what is your perspective on 68% of our borrowing being externally?
Well, my perspective would be that it is quite dangerous, and as I had said earlier, that our external borrowing is yet to lead to us into a debt trap, whereby at one point in time we are going to lose the resources we have. Yes, I know the ECOP is the beacon light of hope for Uganda, but if we keep on getting money from external sources, we are going to face that problem. And so if you look at that, you really see that Uganda at one point in time would end up losing all these resources to external countries, and it will be then now the citizens that will suffer. So if you go back to the previous discussion on IMF, World Bank versus China.
Arthur's refused
Yes.
to move on.
No, okay, what I'm trying to say is that I'm not saying that borrowing from China is good, but I'm trying to show you why African countries keep on running back to China rather than World Bank and IMF. We see that the policymakers and those who are engineering the borrowing of this money really try to front ideas that there is a necessity to finish something. Of recent, we see that they are trying to front the idea of borrowing 240 million from China to fight corruption. And you see that the policymakers are quite selfish. I'm not saying that as a country it is helping us, but you see that African countries, especially dictatorial leaders, would keep on running back to China to get money. But World Bank would now put up restrictions on what you should borrow and how you should use it, and what you should do and what you should not, which China is not doing. China will give you confidentiality. Today, if I say that if you go to a bank as a person, you borrow money, you sign the contract between you and the bank, but they do not publish this contract to, in the public to say that Ssemuyaba Arthur has borrowed this much. So the same, and Arthur would feel happy if such secrets are kept to the bank. Now, the same thing is happening with Uganda or other African countries with China, that there is confidentiality between China and Uganda. And they keep on borrowing this money and borrowing. So African leaders will feel like, we should go back to the Chinese. And that's why President Museveni keeps on saying, my friends, the Chinese, my friends, the Chinese. Because he knows that these people keep it in a form of a business. It is confidential and it is helping. Whenever they need money, China is ready to give them the money. But World Bank would be a little bit, it would keep on putting various dropbacks to see that they do not give them the money.
Yeah, like IMF, you cannot borrow beyond your SDA.
Yes, and of recent, as we see that ECOP, they released a resolution that we should not go ahead with the East African oil pipeline. But China is willing to finance and say, for us, we are ready. If you have the project, we are going to give you the money. But since they're, for World Bank and the others, they are not supporting ECOP, they would feel like, no, we are not giving you the money. Now, what's the alternative? Now, this African country, Uganda, would have now to run back to China to get the money from them.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me bring Sylvia into the discussion. Moving on from the IMF World Bank discussion, let's talk about domestic borrowing. Now, the Bank of Uganda report also showed that however much external borrowing exceeds internal borrowing, Uganda has also increased internal borrowing internally, meaning Uganda is also borrowing from the commercial banks internally, and it has increased that level. What is your perspective on that?
First of all, we already have high debts externally. Now we are bringing our high debts internally. I feel the government is competing with the private sector on debts. So the government could be getting money internally, but suppressing the private sector because people also want to get loans. Now, if a government comes and wants to get a loan of some billions from a bank, what will the private sector do? What will happen to the private sector? I feel it is suppressing to the private sector. Now, if, for example, the Standard Chartered Bank or other banks, private banks, the interest rate is high compared to external borrowing, and external borrowing, I mean from organizations, not from external banks, organizations. So it does not leave room for economic growth if we start borrowing internally. Economic growth, which is economic growth in a country is babysitted by the private sector. And if that private sector is suppressed by its real government, then I think we are not doing anything. So I don't believe in the government starting to borrow internally. Though we can minimize our external debts and we store on those ones, but internal borrowing is not.
Internal borrowing should be left alone.
Should be left alone for the citizens to borrow and develop our private sector because we need taxes from the private sector, so we can't suppress it.
Okay, I can see Ronald's hand.
No,
He is dying to interject. Yes,
yeah,
Ronald.
thank you. I would like to depart from her argument in that, you see, domestic borrowing, in that these commercial banks are in the private sector, some, because these are owned by some individuals. So, of course, giving out a loan to the government is in that these banks are making more money. In that, of course, bank will not give you money that it will end up insolvent. Of course, these banks will make money. They are making money. And domestic borrowing is that these banks should also try to follow up the different reports. What is the IMF saying? Because in the report of 2022, IMF notes that Uganda may enter a danger zone. Of course, they gave that in that the borrowing, that the extent at which we are borrowing is that we are entering a danger zone. And such a red flag should not be ignored by the domestic creditors. In that such a red flag is that Uganda as a state may in the event fail to service those loans. So it shouldn't be ignored, and they should take cognizance of the different reports that are published, not only the IMF report, in that if they say that if they raise those red flags, we should take real caution, should take caution on that and limit. Yes, we can give out the loans, the bank can give out the loans, but how best are we going to service those loans? So my view is that the domestic creditors should give that caution, should not ignore the red flags.
Okay, so Ronald, how would you factor in her discussion, Sylvia's discussion on disadvantaging the private the private people within the country who also borrow?
Yeah, how I would factor in her discussion is that, of course, the private individuals, if those banks kept on giving out, the commercial banks kept on giving on those loans to the government, and the government fails to service those loans, of course, those commercial institutions will run insolvent. And once they run insolvent, meaning these private individuals will not source those loans from those banks. They would be banks that they use to source loans from. So ideally, it disables the private sector now. If a bank wakes up one morning and closes off because it gave the government money and the government failed to pay the loan, ideally the private sector would die out, because the private sector, it's a vehicle of loans. These private individuals source loans from those commercial banks, and ideally would have a monopoly of one bank. You can imagine a state-owned bank with a monopoly of giving out, because reason being that all these other commercial banks closed off because they gave money to the bank, to the government, and the government failed to pay back. Now we are insolvent, and once a bank is insolvent, it closes off. So having a monopoly of a state-owned bank is also dangerous to the private sector. So ideally, it would disable the private sector.
Okay, let me move to Racheal. So Racheal, the elephant in the room, is the state of Uganda's public debt sustainable? Looking at the different factors, do you think this is something we can sustain?
Pardon?
The status of Uganda's public debt. We earlier on had a discussion on where we stand. We had a brief discussion on that with Arthur. So from your perspective, do you think Uganda's public debt is something that we can sustain? Is it sustainable?
Well, I think it's not really sustainable as per se from the discussions we've had, because it's huge. It's huge and we do not have solutions. Yes, the solutions are there, but solutions that are instead depriving us and bringing more debts instead. The example I've given of the Honorable I've forgotten his name, who stood up in Parliament and boldly said how we are lacking credit and how they are actually giving in some money somewhere. That's why the oil is not like functioning very well. Really shows that it is not sustainable. Then the way we take on our revenues, our revenues are not the way we take them on. Then the external debit, how we are borrowing from countries like China, exit bank, which to some extent is depriving us back and taking our own. Well, I'm not saying that IMF also won't take really, but to me, I feel like since we are member and there are conditions that we ought to follow than the other ones, like it's not really sustainable. Then the different bilateral creditors we are trusting the Chinese, because they're actually giving us attention. Yeah, you need the money. Yes, come on. We are ready to help. But ready to help, what are you actually going to do? You're just going to do a road that doesn't bring in profit to the country. So it's like just training us down, and it's instead bringing to us more debts. And the situation we are coming from, Ebola, then COVID, is also adding on, because you have to sustain the citizens in this situation. Yeah, so it's not really sustainable.
Okay, let me come back to Arthur. We are addressing that question, which is the elephant in the room. Do you find the status currently that we have, do you see us sustaining the public debt?
Well, the issue of whether Uganda will be able to sustain the debt really needs a critical analysis. According to Robert Kiyosaki in his book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, though it relates to individuals, but he said that the reason as to why poor people are still poor is because they have more liabilities than assets. So now we can pick a leaf from that government should have more assets than liabilities. And if we try to check on the assets we have in Uganda, we have internal local investors. government on and on has failed to uplift or to see that these local investors are really doing good business in Uganda, and rather it favors the foreign investors, which is quite detrimental to the country. So the local investors are the ones to be uplifted, whereby one, they can give them a little bit of tax fairness. Then secondly, they can try to inject more money in their business in sort of loans. And then these local investors tend to pay back the money. And then secondly, we well know that Uganda is based so much on agriculture. So government has to initiate the Farmers Cooperative Union, which is quite a massive body that would aid different farmers to find market for their products, which is not taking place in Uganda. And then secondly, government has to ensure that it tries to limit the tax holidays it gives to foreign investors. We see that these tax holidays have really caused a very big problem. We see that when foreign investors come into the country, they are given tax holiday of about 5 years as they initiate their business. So in these 5 years, these foreign investors tend to accumulate a lot of wealth. And when they find that the 5 years are yet to extinguish, they choose to declare the business insolvent, and then they leave. And then they come back with a new business, and they keep on doing the same thing. But we see that this money is repatriated back to their countries rather than Uganda. So I think our government has to increase more of its assets than liabilities to say that we try to sustain the debt.
Okay, thank you so much. Moving to Sylvia. Sylvia, how best can the government manage the public debt that we have?
Like I said earlier, we should focus more on production. We should borrow money to produce something that will give us profit, of which profit we shall pay the debt. Secondly, we should, it is called adding value to the products we export, like coffee. Or we see our farmers here sell coffee at lower prices, that is like below 2 euros or like 2 euros. When the people we export the coffee to add a lot of value to it, they export it back at very high prices, like you see Nescafe.
Very expensive.
Very expensive, yet it is us with the raw materials. So if we should learn to add value to our products and we export them when they're of high value, we can get more profit, which will help us pay the debts and prevent the public debt crisis. And then also we should focus on the rule of law. We shouldn't ignore the rule of law. For example, the IGG Betty Kamya said we lose 10 trillion every year, every financial year to corruption. Really, to a developing country, we can't bear losing 10 trillion each financial year to corruption. And she calls them the big fish. So the person we are looking at, the IGG, to fight corruption, is also looking at the big fish. And the big fish are the ones who borrow money for us. So the rule of law must stand to fight corruption, because if we fight corruption, half of our problems in Uganda would be gone. Then also, the Deputy Speaker said we should put a lot of emphasis on buy Uganda, build Uganda. We should buy more products from Uganda. But again, Ugandans are not going to buy Uganda and build Uganda when the products are fake. We should put more emphasis on what we manufacture. How good is it? Is it good for the country? Organizations like the UNBS, Uganda National Bureau of Standards, should also do its work. And then also, we should, I think our leaders, not necessarily all Ugandans, should focus more on spending what is entirely on the budget. Not this supplementary budget, the military needs this, they make a supplementary budget. The State House has a supplementary budget. We should be more specific with what we want, and it should be on our budgets. So that we don't, because our budget is approximately 40 trillion and half of it is from public debt. We are going to get debts because of it. Then also we are going to add the supplementary budgets. I feel it is not fair for a country like Uganda, because when you look at the range in 2015-2016, that financial year, we had a percentage of 24.6% of the GDP. Right now, just 7 years, we're at 50.3. What will happen in more 5 years? We shall be at 70% if we don't curb these things. So I think we need to do a lot, like I've said, to curb public debt crisis.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. Yes, Ronald, still the same question. In your own perspective, how should Uganda manage the issue of public debt?
Yes, how Uganda should manage the public debt, of course, it's subject to debate, and most of the views have been given by my colleagues. But we can start by, of course, ascertaining efforts to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a highlighted area that was the major factor that maybe could have brought our economy down. And given the different reports we've seen, our debt is skyrocketing. It's not any way, it's not reducing. So why don't we start by recovering from, ascertaining efforts to recover from the COVID-19, post-COVID-19. Of course, we had the pandemic, it was everywhere. But we can gather efforts on how we can recoup that. Then the other thing is we heavily rely on imports from these other countries. What I would buy the idea of economic protectionism. Let's protect the industries here, our domestic industries. Buy Uganda, build Uganda, like she said earlier. Let's support that. Of course, when we put economic protectionism on such, for instance, companies like textile companies, the different textile companies will not have the imported textiles. So when we put protectionism on, of course, protectionism has been on certain goods like sugar. We entirely rely on the sugar that we produce here in Uganda. But let's extend the economic protectionism on some other things. We don't need to import everything. Of course, when we import, yes, a Uganda Revenue Authority will argue that they get tax from those, but we can try and divert the tax base when we've fully empowered these the domestic companies or the public sector, the private sector, by, of course, giving the protection is protecting them from the imports. Then there we can expand our revenue base. Our revenue base will grow, and we will not rely ideally on borrowing, because of course borrowing earlier has been there. Now they're here, you borrow in China, you borrow everywhere just to get revenue. And then the other thing that is key is that we are borrowing for consumption. That point has been highlighted. We are only borrowing for consumption. Rather we should be borrowing for investing. Borrow to invest. But now if you borrow to build let's take for instance, you're just consuming to pay salaries of government workers, different employees. You just want to pay their salaries, just that you failed to raise the revenue from which you would get their salaries, but now you're resorting to borrowing. Now, ideally, that is not, because at the end of the day, how will you service this loan that you've borrowed? So ideally, we should shift from borrowing for consumption to borrowing for investment. So those are my views.
Okay, yes, Racheal, your views as well on that question.
Okay. My views on that question. One is the ongoing project, the oil and gas. How about we, as Uganda, the leaders and all, how about they add in more effort? Because oil and gas, as we have known from other countries, they developed on oil and gas. So how about they enforce more? And because it's moving so slow, and it's the little income they're getting from it is instead paying the debt still. So how about they push in so that the different projects, not only that one, so that it produces and they pay some of the debits we have as a country, and then the revenue mobilization needs to be improved. Many organizations are not paying their revenues. Many people don't know why they should actually pay their revenue, and yet it has to develop a country. How about they do something like a sensitization, teach them, let them know, and then by the time they reach to them, they actually know that they ought to give in. Then lastly, about the external debitors and all that, seeking money from those other countries and NGOs and organizations. How about as Uganda also we set our MOU, something of the sort, if you're also not agreeing to our policies, then it's okay, we shall not take it on. Because in the long run, we shall end up having issues of not having our own airport because it has actually been taken away. But how about if we stand our ground as a country and say, you're taking, we are going to take it on, yes, but this is what we are going to do. And if you're not agreeing upon that, it's okay. And we actually go back to our domestic debit and we'll continue as a country.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So we have come to the end of our discussion for today. I'm going to get closing remarks from the panelists in less than a minute each. I'll start with Arthur.
Well, my closing shot is if you look at whether Uganda's public debt is sustainable, we have to see that according to the recent report by the Ministry of Finance Planning and Economic Development, in their report of 2021, they say that the only way to fight public debt is to borrow more debt, to say that we finance different projects that will yield profits to pay off these debts. However, I vehemently disregard this because it will really cause a debt trap for Uganda. And the only way that we can see that we can pay off our debt as we borrow the lesson from rich dad poor dad is that government should have more assets than liabilities, and our assets are the local investors, the farmers, and the projects that are really yielding more profits, and that we have the recent one, the oil project. And then we see that if we are told we have, government should also revisit on how it uses its money. And as we see in the book of Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, is that the ethics on how we should handle money is that you should use that money for the intended purpose, meaning that we should fight corruption, and by fighting corruption, we shall be able to use our money properly. And in that way, we shall be able to sustain our public debt. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Yes, Sylvia.
In my closing remarks, public debt is not the big issue. The big issue is how do we use this money when we get it? If we don't learn to use the money we get properly as a developing country, we are going to stay in this crisis of debts every day. We see countries like Japan, they have high levels of debts, but compared to their percentage of the GDP, their percentages are a bit lower because they are using the debt money to develop, to put things that bring in money to the country. If we don't combat, if we don't curb corruption and the big fish per se, I'm quoting the IGG, the big fish, we are doomed as a country. I hate to say it, but in the next 10 years, our percentage of the public debt to GDP is going to be in 70s, yet we have nothing to show. We have no assets. We have bad roads, we have poor education, services are bad, no assets, nothing, no economic growth, and we are hitting 70% public debt of our GDP. So if we don't fight corruption, the public debt is still soaring up and we shall do nothing about it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sylvia. Let's have Ronald.
Okay, thank you. This brings us, of course, back to our question, is our debt really sustainable? And since we have, I'm going to cite the IMF report. Of course, they stated that if we don't control our debt burden, we would soon enter the danger zones. Now, maybe we can use that hope. Since we've not entered the danger zones, what can we do as a state? And I think one of the, of course, checking the different vices, we have a vice of corruption in this state. Money, there is a way money moves from one office to the other, to these individuals, for, of course, to meet private gains. These people use that money that is intended to facilitate something for a private gain. Now, if we fight that corruption and we minimize on how we get debts, we get loans from the different banks, different creditors. If we minimize that and we hang on the different recommendations given by these different international organizations like the IMF, these organizations write reports down. Now, if at all we follow the given recommendations, I think our debt burden would not skyrocket. It would be minimal, and as a state would control this debt problem. I think that should be the way we should go right now.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, Racheal.
Okay, in my conclusion remarks, what I have to say is that the debit is really huge for our country, first of all. But the fact that we have noticed that it's really huge, then like we have a solution. Like we can come up with solutions to lower it, because we can't do without it really. So like I said earlier, we use what we have as a country, first of all. We work with our projects that are going on, then then the different, the revenue mobilization. We also need, because revenue really adds a lot to the country. Different people have businesses where all over town, but they're not giving in. That's why the country is actually running instead to borrow. But like that's why we are actually getting strained. So as the government, as our leaders, as the parliament, they should sit down and look into these issues and come up with really solutions that are really solutions. Yeah, that is what I can say.
Okay, thank you so much. We have come to the final end of the discussion. Thank you to Arthur, Sylvia, Ronald, and Racheal for gracing our invitation and for being part of this discussion. We have come to the end of the talk show. I would like to say thank you to Center for Constitutional Governance and Civic Space TV for organizing the inter-university debate. I would like to say thank you so much to our viewers for watching. Feel free to tweet, to give your opinion in the comment section, and give your opinion on Twitter, tag CCG and Center and Civic Space TV. I've been your moderator today, and thank you so much. See you again next week, same time.